Welcome everyone to McKellar Township Public Library's Hummingbird Seminar. My name is Debbie McMurray, Library Assistant, and I'll be your host today. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session. Erich Eberts is a fifth-year Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Ph.D. student in Ken Welch's lab at University of Toronto Scarborough campus. He grew up in Westchester, New York, and completed a Bachelor of Science in Biology at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. Erich studies how hummingbirds can strategically save energy by dropping their body temperature and metabolism at night in order to survive long summer nights or to bulk up fat reserves prior to migration in the fall. He also enjoys exploring nature while backcountry camping, hiking, biking, and canoeing. After he completes his PhD, he is planning on traveling and pursuing his passions for field research and wilderness adventure. Welcome, Erich, and I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everyone for being here and for having me. I'm excited to get to talk to you about hummingbirds and particularly what I study about hummingbirds, which is how they use this thing called torpor to save a whole bunch of energy. At different times of the year, they use torpor in different ways. And so I'm going to be talking about how they use torpor when they're nesting, how the amount of energy stores they have is related to the likelihood that they're going to enter torpor or not, how that changes throughout the year, and also how temperature changes the likelihood of if they're going to use torpor or not. So before I get started, I just want to thank, of course, everyone who's here and everyone who's helped organize this webinar. I really appreciate it. And some of my past advisors and mentors, especially Peter Auger, Maria Curley, and Eric Strauss, who were my mentors at Loyola Marymount in my undergrad. And then Anusha Shankar, who studies torpor and hummingbirds in a very similar way that I do, and she really inspired me to do what I'm doing today, and we still work really closely together. And then, of course, Ken Welch in my lab here in Toronto, who, you know, none of this work would have been possible without. And then, of course, some of my funding sources as well. So just briefly, a little bit about me. I grew up in New York, like Debbie mentioned, and from a really young age, even before I could remember, apparently I loved birds. So my grandmother was a birder, and she had tons and tons of bird statues. And apparently when I was about 3 years old, before I can remember, I fell in love with this statue of, I think it's a green heron, but I still have it today. And apparently I would just take it everywhere with me. So I apparently loved birds before I couldn't even remember. And so, you know, it made sense that I ended up studying biology and going to Loyola Marymount, where I got some opportunities to do some undergrad research and travel abroad. So I went to Costa Rica and realized that hummingbirds are just incredible and they're everywhere. And then I was also, after I graduated, I was also able to go to Ecuador, and that's where I met Anusha and learned about torpor and how to study torpor. And then when I came back to Los Angeles, I was fortunate to get a research fellowship for about a year where I could do whatever I wanted in terms of research. And so I decided to do some thermal imaging on hummingbirds that were nesting and seeing if they used torpor. So I'll get into that in just a minute. And that study essentially led me to want to do a PhD. And that's how I ended up coming here to Toronto, where the lab was very, you know, really well fit to be able to study torpor based on the expertise of my advisor and the lab in general. So here I'm studying essentially the ecological physiology of torpor use in hummingbirds. So today, like I mentioned, a lot of it's going to be about torpor and how hummingbirds are using torpor. So first, I'm going to talk about this study that I did with thermal imaging cameras in Los Angeles on nesting Allen's hummingbirds. And then I'm going to talk about one of my major studies here in my thesis that looks at the effects of body composition and body fat on the likelihood that ruby throats are going to go into torpor during the summer and the migration season and how that might change. And I'm also going to briefly talk about the effect of temperature in that summer breeding period, as well as the spring period where most of the birds are going to be migrating. And this again is in ruby throats. And then lastly, hopefully I'll have time to get to this, but I just recently wrote a meta-analysis paper on the effects of artificial feeders on pollinators and their pollination activity. So I will wrap up with that. So just to start, of course, there's about 330 species of hummingbirds. They're generally the smallest birds, and they sort of range from about 2 grams to 20 grams. So that's about the weight of a dime to the weight of about 20 or 10 dimes. And mainly what these birds, as everybody knows, eats is nectar, floral nectar or sugar water. They also eat some insects, but the main bulk of their energy comes from sugar, essentially. So they need that really high energy sugar to be able to do things like hover. And to be able to support that activity of hovering, they need to have an extremely high metabolism. So that means that they just burn their energy really, really quickly. And that's why they want to eat sugar, because that's really easily digestible and metabolized into this high energy activity. So to be able to fuel all that high energy activity, they want to maximize the amount of energy that they eat and intake during the daytime. And they can do that during the daytime because they can find lots of flowers in the light. But once it gets dark, they still have those extremely high metabolisms, but they can't find the fuel and the food to actually allow them to support that high metabolism. So if they need to, they can do this thing called torpor and lower their metabolism and also their body temperature. And that allows them to save a whole bunch of energy. And so they have this sort of dichotomy of they want to maximize their energy gain during the daytime, but minimize their energy loss during the nighttime. And I'm going to be focusing on, like I said, just 2 species of hummingbirds, but generally these, energy maximization versus energy minimization kind of themes are applicable to pretty much any hummingbird. Excuse me. So what is torpor exactly? Basically, torpor is this strategy that these birds use to lower their metabolic rate pretty drastically, and with that comes a lowering of their body temperature. And so that can allow them to save a whole bunch of energy because they don't have to sustain those really high metabolic rates and body temperatures. So here's a graph of their metabolic rate on the y-axis here is in the rate of oxygen consumption, so how much oxygen they're consuming out of the air, and then that's across the time of night. So first in this pink here, and this, sorry, is a thermal image of a bird that's going to be, going through these stages of torpor. So first in pink here, we've got this period of normothermy where the bird has a high metabolism and body temperature. And then he enters torpor pretty steeply. He's going to stay in torpor at that nice, stable, low metabolism for about 30% of the night or so, and then really quickly arouse about an hour or 2 before the sunrise. And then again, he's going to stay in normothermy for that last little period before he can go and fly and find some more food. So that was just sort of a quick snapshot of the torpor, but this is going to be a actual video of a whole bunch of thermal images pushed together. And you can see right about now, he's going to start going into torpor, and he's going to just blend right into the background. So you can see the background temperature is pretty much the same as his body temperature, and then really quickly arouse in the morning. And then now he can go fly and find some more food. So torpor is this really cool extreme change in physiology, and it is dictated by the ecology, the situation, the conditions that the birds are in at a given time. So I'm really interested in that sort of ecology of how and why hummingbirds are using torpor in nature. So of course, torpor can allow these birds to save lots of energy, but if they use torpor too much, that could come at a cost of increased predation risk or impaired feather growth, impaired egg incubation, or immune function, because essentially when they're dropping their metabolism, they're dropping all of their bodily functions except those which are definitely, like, absolutely necessary to still be alive. So there's a few main hypotheses as to why and when hummingbirds will use torpor in nature. The first and sort of the most common is the energy emergency strategy. So this pretty much says that hummingbirds, fluctuate in their energy reserves throughout a day. They usually increase, and then at night they're going to decrease because they're using their bodily energy stores. And then if they ever hit a specific low threshold where they have to have that much energy or they're going to die, they'll use torpor. So this is like a survival strategy, basically. Another hypothesis, really the other major one, is the energy maximization strategy, where in the daytime they're going to increase their energy stores by eating a whole bunch of food and converting that into fat. But then at nighttime, they're not going to use that up. They're just going to pretty much maximize their use of torpor, therefore maximizing their amount of spared fat stores. And then the next day, they can just increase their energy reserves even more. And a few nights of this can really increase their energy stores over the course of just a couple of days. And then a sort of caveat, a really important caveat, is that the ways in which these birds are using torpor, either by the energy emergency strategy or the maximization strategy, seems to be seasonally dependent. So a few studies have shown that in the autumn, especially with rufous hummingbirds, which are also migratory, they use torpor more often than in the summertime. And so some of my studies in the coming slides will get into that difference, that change of torpor use in between the seasons. So first, one major season is, of course, the breeding season, which is typically the summertime in North American hummingbirds. So this was the study that I did at LMU right after my undergrad. And we were essentially finding all these nests around campus. And I had previously learned about thermal imaging, which is a super non-invasive remote monitoring technique. So we didn't have to touch the birds. We didn't have to really disturb them very much at all. But we got these thermal cameras and we put them about 1 meter away from the nests, and we could analyze their body temperatures and see if they use torpor. And our main sort of driving question was, how are these moms maintaining their own energy balance while also keeping their offspring nice and warm so that they develop properly and optimally? And we were wondering if torpor use, because the birds are cooling themselves down, does that interfere with raising offspring? So basically, this was a really simple question. Are the birds using torpor or are they not? And we hypothesized that the birds are going to very rarely, the nesting birds at least, will very rarely use torpor when they're incubating and brooding eggs and chicks, in order to maintain that optimal development of those chicks and those offspring. So for this study, just quickly, we of course looked at the Allen's hummingbird, which is one of probably 2 dominant hummingbird species. The other is Anna's hummingbirds. There's of course a whole bunch of other species out west, but these guys were the 2 main ones at campus. They're about 3 grams, so about the same size as ruby throats that we have here. And these guys are pretty much year-round residents in LA. And in the urban areas where there's tons of food, there's tons of nesting sites, they probably breed year-round, but sort of historically they've bred between November and June. So like I said, we found a whole bunch of nests. This is a bird's eye view of campus, and all these little markers are where we found nests. And so yeah, we found over 60 nests. We ended up only monitoring about 14 of them, just because of the stage that we found them at and the location that we were able to put a camera at. And we recorded 108 nights for each of those 14 individual birds. And I should have mentioned that only the females do anything with raising the offspring. The males, all they do is mate with the females, and then they're off and they're doing their own thing. They do probably protect the territory that the female is nesting in, so it's kind of indirect helping, but pretty much the only partner is that's sitting on the nest is the female. So we used these thermal cameras that were relatively inexpensive. You know, thermal cameras can be hundreds of thousands of dollars if they're super, super fancy and high end. These guys were a lot cheaper and more affordable. And we actually did a crowdfunding campaign to help purchase these cameras because they were still kind of expensive, at least for an undergrad. And these were really nice because we could just put them right, again, like I said, a few feet away from the nest and run that camera, and it was all hands off. The bird did its own thing. And basically what we found was that the hummingbirds very, very rarely use torpor. Just one bird used torpor on 2 nights of those 108 bird nights that we looked at. So in this graph here, we have the eye temperature, which is just basically the body temperature of the bird across the night. And in pink, we've got all these normothermic nights where the bird did not use torpor. But on these 2 nights, you can see the bird remained normothermic for quite a while, and then just at the end of the night, dropped its body temperature quite a bit. So in just these 2 nights, this one individual used torpor. And we think that this might be related to some bad weather, particularly rain on at least one of these nights. So here we have that graph of eye temperature across the time of night, and I'll play this video so that you can see it's a little bit fast, but I'll kind of narrate it. So here the bird's just sort of normothermic doing its thing, and then it starts raining. See how the bird kind of gets wet there? Oops, I restarted that. The bird kind of gets wet and drops down because it's heavier because it's getting wet, right? And that's this period of rain here. And then kind of dries off a little bit. You can see it raises back up. And then it's like, oh, I got to go into torpor. Goes into torpor for, an hour or so, and then arouses in the morning and goes off and gets some food for its chicks. So here's just another, clip. This bird definitely experienced rain and it definitely got wet. And you can imagine if it got wet, then it's probably going to be colder and harder, take more energy to sustain that high metabolism. And so it probably entered torpor because it didn't have enough energy to survive necessarily. So again, just sort of to wrap up, how and why do nesting hummingbirds use torpor? Well, they rarely use torpor, probably to maintain the optimal development of their offspring, make sure they're nice and warm. But they can probably avoid that by having this really warm, insulating nest. And they actually also probably get some extra heat from the metabolism of the chicks. And one really important factor in how they might avoid torpor is by having a nice sheltered location. So if they're under some kind of canopy, they're less likely to get wet. And one of the main things is probably that they just tack on a whole bunch of extra fat. So they have a whole bunch of extra energy reserves. And in my next little bit, I'm going to explain why that extra body fat is probably really important. So in this study, kind of transition to ruby throats, but like I said, these basic energetic balance, the basic equation that allows them to balance their energy is probably pretty similar across hummingbirds, especially of similar sizes. So fat is the main energy source that the birds use at night. Like I said, they eat sugar all day long, but then they can't find the sugar at night. So for the most part of the night, fat is going to be how they're fueling their metabolism. And so torpor use, which is an energy saving strategy, is probably sensitive to the main energy source, which is fat, which is an endogenous internal body fat. And so again, there's this energy emergency sort of energy store dependent threshold hypothesis, where if they ever hit this low threshold, they're probably going to enter torpor. And another that study that have this graph was back in the 1970s. So this was one of the first major papers that was like, why are these hummingbirds using torpor? Maybe it's based on their energy. Another study in the 90s looked at that hypothesis more specifically just on one given night. And so this graph here on the right shows the energy reserves on just one night. And if the bird started with a really high fat level, it never hit that threshold, so it never entered torpor. But on nights when it had less energy stores at the beginning of the night, it used those energy stores up and then at some point hit this threshold and became torpid and used their energy at a lower rate. So basically what I wanted to do in this study was look more specifically at how the instantaneous energy stores are associated with torpor initiation and how that might change seasonally. So I kind of already mentioned this, but the basic question is does this energy emergency threshold operate in nature? And one study actually did look particularly at fat. So that's that previous study here I forgot to mention was looking at just body mass. So the entire body mass of the bird, which includes its fat, but also muscle, feathers, bones, all that kind of stuff. So looking at specifically fat might give us a better picture of exactly why the birds are going into torpor. So one study in 2003 did look at the amount of fat that the birds had on them at the time that they entered torpor, and this was in Anna's birds, I believe. Actually, this was in 3 different species. We don't have to go there. But basically, they found that anytime that the birds had about 5% of their body mass was fat, they would enter torpor. And unfortunately, this study at the time didn't have the technology that we have today, and so they had to euthanize these individual birds at the time that they entered torpor. And so this study couldn't really look at single individuals and how they use torpor on subsequent nights and just throughout a seasonal change. And like I mentioned earlier, of course, we see that there's this seasonal change in torpor use, particularly in rufous hummingbirds, where these birds are using torpor more often in the fall migration season compared to the summer breeding season. And I wanted to see if that was consistent with ruby-throated hummingbirds, which of course breed in the summertime in eastern North America. And during this time, they want to have a really low body mass so that they can be really agile in the air to perform things like courtship displays and territorial defense. But they, of course, migrate about 5,000 miles south to Central America. And to do that, they need to fatten up, much like many, many other long distance migrants, so that they can fuel that really energetically expensive journey. So before they leave, of course, they want to fatten up. And one study previously in our lab looked at how these wild hummingbirds at one of our field sites in Newmarket were changing their energy stores between each day within each day and between days leading up to migration. So first here on the left, we have on the y-axis, we have body mass. And you can see that their body mass each day kind of went up, but then it went back down and then went up and then went back down. And it's a relatively consistent body mass throughout or between each day. But then just 4 days prior to migration, they started increasing their body mass even more during the day. And that allowed the birds to increase their body mass just 4 days before migration quite a bit. So they increased their body mass about 1 whole gram, which is a lot for just a 3-ish gram hummingbird. And one of the main things that the study suggested was that the birds eating during the daytime, eating even more during the daytime than they normally would, was the main factor in how they were able to fatten up. But they also suggested, and weren't quite able to conclude this, but they suggested that torpor was helping them lose less fat overnight, and again, sort of allow them to really rapidly increase their body mass. But again, they couldn't really conclude that confidently because they didn't watch the birds overnight. These were wild birds, and we basically don't know where hummingbirds sleep. So anything that anybody has really done on torpor use or any nocturnal energy expenditure in hummingbirds has been in the lab. So again, we're sort of interested in how this body composition changes between the summer and the migration period are associated with changes in torpor use. And so for this study, I looked at, of course, how the body composition, the body fat changed, how the torpor frequency and duration, as well as the amount of energy that the birds had on them, the amount of fat rather that the birds had on them at the time that they entered torpor, how that changed between the summer and the migration periods. And then also I looked at how torpor duration, the role of torpor duration in this ability to really quickly fatten up in comparison with the amount of food that they ate during the daytime. So for this study, of course, I needed birds. So I captured some wild hummingbirds and then held them in captivity so that I could study them throughout the summer and then into the fall. And we sort of mimicked their natural photo period so that they would, their physiology would gradually change from this summer photo period to a more migratory photo period where they were fattening up. Pretty much on their own. And so, like I mentioned, 20 years ago, they needed to euthanize each individual bird when it entered torpor. But now with today's technology, we can actually measure the amount of fat that the birds had on them via this method that's non-invasive. It doesn't kill the birds at all. You don't, the bird just has to be immobilized in this little Tootsie Roll like thing. So we put it into this machine. This machine is called a quantitative magnetic resonance machine. And it's very similar to an MRI and how it works, but instead of pumping out an image, it gives you 3 numbers. It gives you how much fat, the mass of fat in the bird, the amount of lean mass, so that's like muscle and ligaments and things like that, and how much water was in the bird. The real thing we were interested in is the fat. And then we also use this thing called respirometry, which is basically measuring the air that the bird breathes. So we're measuring how much oxygen the bird consumes and carbon dioxide the bird produces. And from those data, we can calculate the amount of energy that the bird is spending. So the amount of fat that the bird is burning. And that's just what sort of respirometry looks like there. We put the bird in a little box and leave him overnight for the most part. And in this study, we didn't actually feed the bird when it was in the box. So the only energy stores it could use was fat. And from all these data, we could calculate how much fat that the birds had on them at the time that they entered torpor. So that was a really important sort of data point that we could calculate. So into some results now. So looking at morning body mass, we wanted to see how body mass changed. And of course, there was substantial differences in the body mass throughout the period, the summer into the fall. And we wanted to see for each individual bird how that how they changed their individual body mass. And so we pretty much identified these 3 different periods where there was a consistent body mass, really low in the summertime. Then the birds fattened up rather quickly in a week or so, and then they remained at this stable high body mass, which was in migration period. So once we broke that original graph up into those different periods, we can see there's these clear flat summer period, and then this higher body mass in the migration period. And just to confirm that those changes in body mass were driven by changes in fat mass, we compared those 2 variables, and of course increased that they're very highly correlated between morning body mass and fat mass, but they weren't correlated. Body mass was not correlated with lean mass. So this wasn't that the birds were just bulking up their muscles. It was really that they were bulking up their fat stores. So into some more interesting results now. So this is looking at the probability of torpor use on the y-axis. So 1 or 100% would be the birds are using torpor, 0 would be the birds are not using torpor. And we compared that with the amount of fat that the birds had on them in the evening, so at the start of the night. So fatter birds in the summertime were less likely to use torpor versus the opposite of that. Of course, leaner birds were more likely to use torpor if they didn't have enough energy, basically. But that relationship completely flipped in the migration period, where fatter birds were more likely to use torpor. So that was the first hint that something drastic is changing here. Next, very similar story with the amount of time that the birds stayed in torpor for, where fatter birds used torpor for less amount of time in the summertime, but that relationship disappeared in the migration period. Where actually this is a sort of important note, I don't show this here graphically, but in the migration period, instead of evening fat being the important component of whether or how long the birds were going to use torpor for, the night length was the more important thing. So that was starting to suggest that birds are sort of maximizing their use of torpor when these nights are getting longer and longer in the early fall. Then this is probably the most important and striking result of this study, where we are comparing the amount of fat that the birds had on them at the time that they entered torpor across the time of night. So in the summertime, we see this really low threshold where if the birds pretty much ever hit 6%, they were very likely to enter torpor at that time. But that completely changed in the migration period when birds were entering torpor at really, really high fat levels, when they had plenty of fat. They didn't need to use torpor to survive, but instead they were probably using this more energy maximization strategy. Then finally, to look at the role of torpor in these birds fattening, how torpor allowed these birds to fatten essentially, in comparison with the amount of food that they ate. So here on the left, we have the amount of time that the birds spent in torpor during the fattening period, compared with the amount of fat that the birds tacked on and the length of that fattening period. So really, really interestingly, we found that the longer the birds spent in torpor during this fattening period, the more they were able to fatten up. But we didn't see that relationship with the amount of food that the birds ate. So that was sort of interesting, but it suggests that torpor is actually one of the more important factor in how these birds fatten up prior to migration. So to wrap up here, basically in the breeding season, the birds maintain these really low body masses, use torpor more frequently and longer when, more frequently and longer when they were skinnier, when they were not as fat. And they use torpor based on a low fat threshold that functioned as a survival mechanism, basically. But that pattern just totally changed in the migration period when there was substantial fat increases and the low threshold was abandoned. And so the birds used torpor for longer on longer nights. And like I mentioned, the longer torpor durations were highly correlated with the amount of fat the birds could tack on during that period. So basically, the birds used an energy emergency threshold for torpor use in the breeding period, versus in the migration period, they shifted to an energy maximization torpor use strategy. And looking at more than just hummingbirds, this is really interesting because migrating bats use a very, very similar torpor-assisted migration strategy, where they use torpor to essentially migrate faster because they don't have to spend as much time refueling. So yeah, next, I was interested in, of course, how air temperature affects torpor, because a lot of times the story of torpor gets simplified to hummingbirds or any animal that's capable of using torpor is going to use torpor if it's cold out. And that's a pretty good hypothesis, but it's lacking some sort of direct connection between the environmental condition and the physiological condition that is actually more closely related to initiating torpor. So, of course, temperature should affect or does affect the metabolic rate, where colder conditions, the birds are going to have to use more energy to sustain the same amount, the same body temperature. And so they're going to be using higher fat, more fat in colder temperatures. And so it might be more likely that the birds reach this torpor threshold on colder nights. So here's a graph to sort of explain that. This is the graph that we saw earlier of just one single night and the bird's energy reserves on the y-axis across the time of night. At 20 degrees, which is relatively warm, the birds experience that pretty often in the summertime. A bird starting out with high energy stores is probably not going to hit that threshold. But then at some point, if the bird starts with lower energy stores, might hit that threshold and use torpor. On a colder night, the birds will use their energy stores at a faster rate. So they're going to drop faster. That slope is higher. And they're going to maybe hit that threshold earlier in the night. And then there's one other hypothesis, or sort of a second version of this hypothesis. This would be the static version, where the threshold is always set at the same level no matter what temperature it is. But it could also be that the birds anticipate that they're going to have higher energy costs when it's colder, and so they might raise that threshold on colder nights to make absolute sure that they have enough energy to make it until the morning so that they can go out and feed and replenish those energy stores. So I basically made the prediction that on colder nights, hummingbirds will use torpor more frequently and sooner and for longer and at a higher fat level. So I predicted that these birds are going to use torpor based on this temperature modulated fat threshold, which basically means that they're going to enter torpor at higher fat levels on colder nights. And so I looked at two different conditions, seasonal conditions again here. I looked at the spring, where the birds, of course, migrate northward. And when they're migrating northward, in comparison to the fall migration, they're going to be experiencing more cold temperatures and less food availability, and also longer nights. So more energetically challenging conditions as they go northward. But then again, they're going to get to the breeding season and want to maintain these low body masses so they can defend their territories and impress the females. So for the study, again, I captured wild birds, held them in captivity over the winter and into spring. And then I did overnight respirometry again at 3 different temperature conditions, 10, which the birds do experience, especially in the springtime, 20, and a really hot temperature of 30 degrees. In the summertime, I did the same fat measurements as I did in that previous study, where I put the birds in this QMR machine, measured their fat. But in the springtime, I actually did this at a different location, and I didn't have the QMR available. So I was able to estimate their body mass, or their fat mass, based on their body mass with that correlation that I generated in the first study. And again, I wanted to look at the frequency, or the likelihood that the bird's going to enter torpor, the amount of time that the birds entered torpor for, and how much fat that they had on them at that time that they entered torpor. So first, really quickly, this is metabolic rate on the y-axis in both these graphs in the spring and the summer. The left here is for normothermic, so high body temperature. The right is for when they were in torpor. And this is across ambient temperatures in both the spring and the summer. The colder temperatures, they had to use more energy versus the warmer temperatures, and pretty much the same deal for when they were in torpor. So colder temperatures are more expensive energetically. So then I wanted to, of course, look at how likely these birds were going to use torpor. And again, this is comparing this with the amount of fat that they had on them at the beginning of the night. And in the summertime, at both cold and warm temperatures, so 10 and 20, the birds did use torpor way more often in the cold temperatures, and about 65% in the warm temperatures. And at that warm temperature, again, it's the same relationship that we saw earlier, where the higher the fat at the beginning of the night, the more likely it was that the birds were going to use torpor. But then in the migration season, or the spring season rather, we saw that relationship flip, where the fatter the birds were, they were more likely to use torpor. And actually, they pretty much used torpor on every night that I studied them. And important to note that pretty much no birds use torpor at the 30-degree temperature, except in the springtime, where one bird used torpor on 2 nights. So that was kind of interesting, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Again, torpor duration, comparing with evening fat, we saw in the summertime, birds use torpor for less amount of time when they were fatter, but they actually use torpor for longer if it was colder. And in the springtime, we didn't really see any relationship with fat again, and it was actually slightly longer at the colder temperature as well. Then this is the most important and most interesting. We're looking at the threshold here again. So in the summertime, at the 20-degree, it was lower, and in colder nights, it was actually 2% higher, which seems a little small, but it was clearly they were entering torpor at higher fat levels when it was colder. And then in the springtime, there was no difference between temperatures, and again, they had this really high threshold where they probably didn't need to use torpor to survive, but they were entering torpor anyway. And then just a sort of an interesting sort of result of the birds either using torpor or not in these ambient temperatures. In the summertime, they maintained really consistent morning body masses, whether they used torpor or didn't, across temperatures. But in the springtime, when they used torpor, they actually had higher morning body masses or morning fat contents compared to if they did not use torpor. So to wrap up, basically in the summertime, the birds are using torpor more frequently and longer in the cold and have a higher threshold in the cold, and that allows them to maintain lower body masses or consistent low body masses despite those cold temperatures. And that suggests that the threshold that the birds decide to use torpor at is changed by the amount of energy that the birds think they might need to use for the whole night. So these birds are doing some sort of calculus to determine, okay, how much energy am I gonna need, and at what point do I need to use torpor based on that amount of energy that the night is going to demand. But in the springtime, we see a completely different strategy where the birds are essentially using torpor to maximize the amount of energy gain, and that might be to deal with things like those more energetically expensive conditions that they experience as they migrate northward. So lastly, we're going to shift away from torpor. I know I talked a whole bunch about torpor. You guys are probably sick of me saying torpor. So now we're going to look at a project that I recently did, looking at the potential conservation implications of feeding hummingbirds and other nectivorous vertebrates. So I'm looking at bats as well as other nectar birds, so things like lorikeets and sunbirds, other places in the world. Of course, hummingbirds are only in North America, but there's other similar types of animals elsewhere. So I did this meta-analysis, which is, I didn't collect any of my own data for this study. I just looked at what has been published already and tried to synthesize some of that data and make sense of whether feeders were helping with hummingbird pollination or nectivore pollination or hurting it. So basically, pollination is really important for ecosystem diversity. Everybody knows that, as well as human-related things like food production. And humans also just love interacting with these pollinator species because it encourages appreciation for nature. And some of the strategies that humans can use to encourage pollinator diversity and abundance is, of course, attracting them with artificial feeding, as well as enhancing their habitat with things like bird baths and native flowers. And so there could be also some potential consequences of artificial feeders. Mainly, one hypothesis that the artificial feeders are so attractive that the birds only go to those feeders and don't actually go to those flowers and do their pollination. And so I wanted to look at, what the literature says in terms of how beneficial or consequential are artificial feeders and also habitat restoration. So I won't get into detail here, but basically I did this literature search on the Web of Science and included terms that were in the categories of pollination or nectivity, artificial feeding, a sort of biological response, so diversity or abundance of these animals, or pollination activity. And then I looked at only vertebrate animals, so mammals and birds in particular. Overall, I found 600-ish studies that I had to parse through and see what was relevant and what wasn't. And I ended up with 40 studies that I looked at qualitatively. So I just looked at what the major, conclusions were of those studies, and then 10 studies that had quantitative data that I could actually compare the effects between these treatments where the bird maybe had access to a feeder versus a bird that didn't have access to a feeder, and those compared the pollination activity in those two conditions. Basically, I found just 10 studies, 4 of those were on hummingbirds, 5 of them were on other nectar birds elsewhere in the world, and then there was 1 paper on bats. And I won't get into the specifics of how I did the analysis, but it generated this big old plot, which is a little bit intimidating. There's lots of words here, but basically, there on the left here, we've got treatment. So that's conditions where a feeder was available versus the control where there was no feeder available. And I broke this up into 4 different categories: the sort of the effect on pollinator reproduction, then the effect on pollinator presence, which was some sort of diversity or abundance measurement, then pollinator success, so in terms of like seed set and like seed production and how well those evidence that the birds did pollinate a plant, and then just pollinator activity as well, so just the bird visiting a flower. So basically, I didn't find any effect of feeders or no feeders in the pollination, reproduction, success, or activity categories, but I did find a significant positive effect of the presence of feeders on whether birds were around, whether lots of different species were around, or whether lots of individuals were around. So the more feeders, the more birds that it attracted, which is not very surprising, but it is an important, finding. The qualitative kind of review, where I looked at the overall conclusions of the papers and the trends that they suggested that feeders help with range expansion and abundance. They can help with habitat connectivity and facilitating migration, especially when natural food sources might be low. The birds might be able to, or the animals might be able to sort of recoup some of those missing energy resources. And something important with habitat restoration, of course, natural vegetation or feeders and habitat restoration can help with facilitating the pollination of those natural native species in comparison with invasives. And then there were a couple sort of studies that suggested that there could be consequences for pollination, but those were relatively few in the grand scheme of things. So to wrap up, basically, I came to the conclusion that feeders and habitat improvement can help pollinator diversity, and there's no clear negative effect of the presence of feeders on the pollination activity and plant reproductive success. And so I would suggest anyone who's able to could put up a feeder in conjunction with planting some native species, and that might help attract the feeder might help attract the birds and the animals to those gardens, or to be able to pollinate and increase that pollination activity on native species. And of course, this is only one component of conservation of pollinators. And we, of course, need lots more studies to be able to more competently say that feeders do this or that. But overall, feeders are okay, best if they can be in conjunction with natural flowers. So yeah, with that, I hope I didn't go too long, but thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. On behalf of myself, Debbie McMurray, and the McKellar Township Public Library, for such an informative and super interesting presentation. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I definitely have a new appreciation for how sophisticated hummingbirds biology is. So thank you for that. I'd also like to say thanks to the Manitowoc Lake Community Association and the Lake Stewardship Committee of the Township of McKellar for co-sponsoring this presentation. So at this time, we'd be happy to invite questions. And I see that Diane has her hand up. So we'll go ahead and unmute you, Diane.
I'm trying to post a picture of what I had on my hummingbird feeder. It was a very unusual kind of hummingbird. It was a flying squirrel. And I couldn't figure out what was eating the jelly at night, because obviously it wasn't a hummingbird, and it was an adorable. I'll try and see if I can post it. It was a beautiful flying squirrel.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I've
never ran into a flying squirrel at a feeder yet, but I've gotten, of course, raccoons and deer. Deer love it. But yeah, that's awesome.
I'll see if I can post it. No, it won't post. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I do belong to an online birding group, and one of the things they really stress is about cleaning the bird feeders every time you replace the nectar, because there's a black mold, and a lot of people don't realize that those feeders with the red flowers and the little yellow center things come completely apart, so you can disinfect them.
Yep. Yeah, that is very important. I mean, sure everyone who's put up a feeder and forgot to change it once a week or more has seen that it goes cloudy as well. So there's definitely microbes proliferating in those feeders if you don't clean them, and those could potentially have some harmful effects on the hummingbirds. There have been a couple studies on potential health effects of feeders. Most of those studies have been done by a researcher called Lisa Tell at the University of California in Davis. Basically, those few studies haven't shown very clear negative health effects of the feeders. I've also done a very brief study on actually red dye. So that's another thing that's really common, that sort of the commercial businesses suggest that you use this red dye to attract the hummingbirds. But that really doesn't do anything, and it's not necessarily harmful, but it potentially harmful based on the different way that dye breaks down in UV light. And so it's just, if it doesn't do anything, it's probably better not to actually use that red dye, because the birds are going to be attracted to the red feeder anyway. So yeah, I mean, it is definitely really important to keep your feeders clean and minimize any potential impacts of those, microbe rich little solutions there.
Thanks, Eric. I see there is a question from Adriana, similar to what you've been discussing. She asks, Eric, there is talk that purchased hummingbird food is not good. Do you know anything about that, if sugar water is best? And maybe, Eric, you can maybe tell us how to go about preparing our own hummingbird solution.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, we just use sucrose, so just table sugar and water. If you have the ability, boiling that water and then cooling it down before you put it into the feeders is best, because then there's no you know, microbes from your tap water originally in there. So it may make that sugar water last a little bit longer while it's still, you know, not potentially harmful to the birds. But it's not absolutely necessary to boil that water. I would definitely suggest not using red dye. Like I said, it's just doesn't do anything as long as your feeder is red already. And I would not, so there was actually one study that used xylitol. I don't think anyone is going to use xylitol. It's this other type of sugar that is relatively rare in flowers, but they fed, I forget what kind of birds, I think it might have been sunbirds, they fed xylitol to from sugar water feeders, and there was a huge flock of them, and like a substantial amount of those birds dropped dead. So don't use xylitol. Best to just use table sugar, so sucrose, and again, replace that sugar water relatively maybe once or twice a week, depending on how hot and cold it is. Of course, in hotter temperatures, that water is going to go bad quicker.
Do you know what the proportion is, Eric, of sugar to water?
Yeah, I mean, it's not super necessary. Flowers typically are from about 15% to 30-ish%. So anywhere in between there is totally fine. So we usually use about 20%. So like 1 cup of sugar for 5 cups of water or so. And in my work, I don't necessarily, it's not exact. I guesstimate it usually. And the birds are going to come, you know, maybe the birds will come if it's a little bit more often, if it's a little bit more concentrated. They might like it a little bit more, but it's not going to be, you know, it's not going to deter them if you have a little bit extra sugar water in there for sure.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Mary. She says, what is the best way to clean your feeders?
Depends on the feeder. So I think someone mentioned there's like some feeders that all come apart, like all the little flowers on them. Those are great because you can get in all the little cracks and make sure that there's no fungus sort of building up. There's like bottle brushes are really good usually to get into all those crevices. If your feeder is dishwasher safe, that's usually a pretty good way to give it a full, you know, a good cleaning. Some feeders though are not dishwasher safe and they will morph when it gets hot in there. So just be careful about that. But yeah, just, you know, I usually just use hot water. Sometimes if it's really, really bad, I'll give like a little bit of dish soap and then make sure I rinse it really, really well. But usually just hot water will do the job in scrubbing it.
Okay, super. Diane says she uses a toothbrush.
Yep.
She cleans in the dishwasher.
Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, seeing none, then I would like to thank all of the attendees today for joining us. We certainly appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you again to Erich for your excellent presentation, and we wish everyone a happy Saturday. Take care, all.
All right, thanks so much.
Erich, if you wouldn't mind staying on the line, that would be great.
Of course.